So, Tamasin, do you want to go ahead with where you come from, what you're doing, what you're up to?
Yeah, so hi, my name's Tamasin. I'm a product designer here at Clio. I've been with Clio a little under 4 years now. I came on board with Clio when our legal aid product was a one-page product proposal and took that through to an initial go-to-market. And now I'm sort of spreading myself more broadly across Clio, looking at a wide range of different problems. I've been in user experience design for probably around 15 years now. I'm located in Kelowna, which for folks who aren't familiar, if you know Vancouver, we're about 500 kilometers inland from Vancouver. But you might guess from my slightly muddled accent at this point, I'm not originally from Canada. So I started off life in the UK. I came to Canada about 20 years ago.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. And there Hallie is. Hi, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm sorry I'm so late.
No, you're
Technical
fine.
difficulties. This is a great example of a design challenge.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us today. And we were just starting off with some introductions. If you want to go over what you're working on, where you're from, and then we'll go into, after that, I think, our questions for today.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thanks for your patience. My name is Hallie Jay Pope. I am the director of the New Jersey Legal Design Lab at Seton Hall Law School Center for Social Justice. We are part of the Housing Justice Project at the Center for Social Justice. So my work is currently focused on using participatory legal design methods to support local movements in the housing justice space in Newark, New Jersey. Very, very excited to be here with Tamasin and
All right. So, our first question right off the bat is I think one that is probably on the minds of a lot of our participants here. So, I want to make sure that we're all coming from the same space. And that is, what is legal design? And what is your relationship to legal design to give context to everything that we're going to be talking about today? Hallie, do you want to start us off?
Absolutely. And I think my answers to these two questions are going to be very much related. So, my background is in cartooning and graphic design. And so I always thought of design as visuals, what something looks like. And as I have dug more into the field of legal design, I've come to understand design more as a set of tools and processes and mindsets for solving problems in a creative and iterative way. And so the way that I talk with my students about this is that if design is just about creative problem solving, then legal design is just about using those creative problem solving tools to explore and construct and hopefully solve legal problems. And so I started out drawing cartoons to explain law to folks, so legal information design. And I've now sort of moved into more focus on the process of legal design. So I'd say my relationship to it is always changing. It's not something I ever plan to do. And
I'm really curious as to what your perspective on this is, Tamazin, because you're coming in from the case management standpoint. So, yeah, what's your relationship to legal design?
Yeah, and my relationship to design sort of more broadly, I started out life as an architect. So I didn't spend a lot of time in the architecture world, but did my undergrad and postgrad in architecture. And then finding my way into user experience, found there were a lot of crossovers between the processes, the structures, and ways in which you think about approaching designing a building versus designing a product, and the way in which a user might want to experience it, and the ways in which they might want to move through it. So for me, legal design as a product designer, it's designing legal products, but really with a user-centered focus. And the key thing for me with legal design is really prioritizing the needs, the experiences, and the challenges of the end users. Especially for myself, being someone coming into the legal space who didn't have a legal background, really that sort of separation of understanding, I am definitely not our end user, and really prioritizing in legal design. It's important to prioritize exactly who that user is, their needs, their wants, and their expectations.
So, you both have touched on this a little bit in your introductions, but I'm wondering if there are any other core principles of legal design that you wanted to highlight for the folks in the audience today. And anybody can
yeah,
start.
I'll build off of what Tamsin was just saying about user centricity, because it's so cool to hear that from somebody who doesn't have a legal background. As a lawyer, I think that is the piece of design that is potentially the most transformative for lawyers in their practices, especially if they're doing public interest oriented law, but also often the most challenging to be like, oh, huh, I don't actually know everything, and maybe other people have forms of expertise different from mine that should be a part of the problem solving process. So I agree that that sort of focus on the user's needs is really key. But I think for those of us using design in the social justice space, we can go beyond sort of user focus and hopefully move towards true participation and co-design. So that is where I've sort of made my home for the past 5-ish years, is trying to use all these amazing tools that have been used, not just in the design context, going back to Scandinavian participatory design and workplaces in the 70s, but also liberatory pedagogy and these other traditions that we have for essentially engaging collectively to understand big problems that, like things that involve law, and to actually tackle those problems. And so doing that together and moving from a viewpoint that recognizes users as a valid source of information to recognizing or breaking down the distinction between users and designers to truly enter a co-design relationship, I think can be so amazing for anyone in the legal space who is really trying to not just serve a community, but to work alongside them. And so I hear this a lot from folks, justice workers, folks in the legal services space. They are very used to that sort of client expert model, and user centeredness starts to challenge that, and then participatory design can push them even further into that collaborative.
And yeah, I think also, well, as well as understanding your users, understanding the problems they need to solve, it's really understanding the ways in which they work. And a lot of us, we work remotely. I'm based here. The majority of the time, I do not get to see our customers, our clients, my other coworkers, but one thing that's really important is actually understanding people in their own physical spaces as well. So one research study we did a little while ago was actually understanding the use of documents and doing a study and spending time with customers in their offices and understanding the transactions and the digital to physical moving of documents in the document space. And really understanding how important that is when looking at principles of legal design, because paper is so prevalent still, even though we're sort of so digital in so much of our lives, we're so physical in a lot of things with documents. And I think especially when we're looking at sort of in the nonprofit space, a lot of documents with sort of people who might not have the same access to technology and needing to get documents signed, and what that sort of end-to-end process and workflow looks like, and how it's really important to consider that, even when I'm designing a digital product, is to consider that digital to physical transaction, and then how to bring that human-centered experience design.
I'm so glad that you touched on that, because I think we'll be highlighting a little bit of how accessibility can factor into legal design further on in this conversation. But first, right off the bat, I want to also ask, why is legal design important, and why should organizations and firms prioritize legal design if they should? And I think, Tamasin, you might have an interesting spin on this, so I might punt it to you first, and then we'll go to Hallie.
Yeah, well, I think from my perspective, like a well-designed legal product can increase the speed and the efficiency at which you're performing complex tasks, and it can simplify the process. So from my perspective, when I'm thinking about product design, if I can improve your efficiency, your speed, and less time on tasks, that's going to lead to more time available to spend one-on-one with your clients. So one thing I'm really kind of always conscious of is time efficiency and sort of breaking down a complex problem and it's making it as simple as possible.
Yeah, and then sort of one dichotomy that I like to think about, or not dichotomy, but one spectrum in legal design is sort of the spectrum from improving and reforming existing systems to dismantling them. And so as somebody who's sort of more on the side of trying to burn it all down, I guess, or to, recognize the ways in which our legal system is actually working as designed and is not broken, but it is in fact perpetuating inequalities that were baked into the system. I think it's funny. I often have like a bit of a reaction to words like efficiency. And it's so funny to Tamasin, because as a user of Clio, I'm like, I'm so glad that that's what you're looking at. And I really do need that to be efficient when I use it. And then for the stuff that I'm trying to create, there is still that element, right, of can we help someone get through a legal reality, a process that is challenging them, an eviction proceeding. There's that immediate harm. But then we are also trying to push them to question why is housing something that can be denied to you on the basis of profit for others. And so I think design is important because it can challenge our understanding of the status quo and give us tools to actually push back against it. And for legal design specifically, for lawyers, it can really help us to reimagine our relationships with our clients and with our communities. So I alluded to this before, right? The classic kind of client lawyer model tends to be somewhat one directional and often somewhat extractive and not particularly holistic. It exists for many lawyers and clients in this crisis moment space. And rarely do we sort of get to dig into why we got to that crisis moment and what happens after it. And so one thing we're trying to do at the lab is sort of open up the realm of what that problem is and construct what the problem is with people who are impacted by it. So it becomes less about what is the lawyer's problem and really what is the community's problem and what role can the lawyer provide in supporting that. And it also helps lawyers to tap into their creative side, which I think is always really exciting. I mentioned I'm a cartoonist, and I think because I go around saying that, people come up and like reveal their creative superpowers to me all the time. There are so many folks in the legal world and in the access to justice space and in the public interest law world and more broadly who have these creative talents, and design gives us permission to sort of think outside the box in a way that I think our legal training has.
I love an element of anarchy, especially in the middle of the workday. So I'm glad that you brought that in. My next question for you all, and I want to first highlight that I think when I asked you both about principles of legal design, you both touched on different aspects of approaching legal design with a sense of humility. You're not the end user, you're designing with someone in mind that you're not quite completely able to fill in their shoes. So my next question to you both is, what are metrics for effective legal design, and how do you know you're actually reaching users like you're intending to? How do you know you're designing appropriately? And
And
that's
certainly in the product space, this is just a multi-step process. There isn't sort of one thing. It begins before you've even conceptualized on designs. It begins with your sort of upfront exploratory research, like, am I understanding users? Am I reaching the right people upfront who are going to be using this product? Am I understanding their needs? Have I defined the right problems to solve? And it's really important that we capture the right problems to solve in the right way before we start sort of sketching or putting pen to paper so that we can get everybody on the same page for that. And that's designing appropriately. So when it comes then, a lot of sort of testing, constant testing, design test, iterate, test. The more we can really engage with end users during the design process, the better. So that might be through sort of moderated usability testing, unmoderated usability testing, concept testing, testing of sort of the large initial concepts or the sort of end state smaller features. And that's really what will help determine if we're designing appropriately. Are we solving the right core problems? Are we reaching the right people and solving those problems for them in the right way? And then when we've gone beyond that concept stage, and we've actually started getting into the more high fidelity product design, are we designing a product that is intuitive and that they can use unassisted? And so that will be where our usability testing comes in more. That'll be that later stage. We've solidified we're solving the right core problems, and now are we solving those problems in the right way? Are we solving the way that makes you efficient, faster, spending less time in Clio? I like to say I know I've been successful when you folks are spending as little time in a product I've designed as possible. And yeah, then we're sort of really it's looking at metrics. Like, have we reached the end users when we've launched something? How many people are using it? How are they moving through the product? Are they reaching the end workflows? Typically, when we're looking at a product design upfront, we'll want to set what does success look like. So success might look like we closed 100 cases last year. We want to be able to use Clio and close of a sort of similar nature of cases, 150 cases this year. And we could use that as a marker of efficiency for moving through a product with greater speed and being able to be more efficient in the workplace. So actually reaching users is done in a multitude of ways, but I think that sort of real end goal is being able to quantify through product metrics that we have actually determined those success metrics that we set up front.
I'm very jealous, Tamasin, that you have product success metrics, because I was actually just having a conversation with a colleague this morning about how we define success and impact in our work, which is, we create design outputs. We are currently focusing on creating informational outputs. And so that process might look very similar to the one that you're just talking about. And I love that you highlighted that defining the right problem is the first step. And so we are working really hard to co-construct problems with people who are impacted by them. So we've been working with tenants and organizers from that initial phase of what is the actual problem all the way through to iterating on and testing an output like a pamphlet or a video or a training. But because we think that the design process, that co-design process, is in itself something that produces impact, we are trying to figure out how we can measure that impact. And this remains a question for us. And we have some ideas, and we're sort of looking for folks with research experience to help us figure this out. But there is research out there that shows that civic engagement and democratic participation is actually a health determinant, and so is housing, which is the space we're working in. So these are feeling, empowered in a process can really have these big effects down the line, as well as setting us up to work towards transformative and collective change. But I think figuring out how do I measure whether the conditions for successfully organizing towards transformative change is really challenging, because I think our hypothesis is that a lot of that is about our conceptions of ourselves. How do our co-designers conceive of themselves through the process of co-creating with us? And you can see it reflected in how they conceive of lawyers versus themselves, right? So a lot of our tenants and organizers come in feeling very deferential towards lawyers and lawyers' expertise. And we do have expertise in certain things, but we actually don't have expertise in really what justice means. That's the question for all of us, and particularly for folks who are experiencing injustice. So we have to sort of challenge our own concepts of our expertise, as I mentioned before, but also to nurture the sense of our co-designers as being experts and being key agents in making change. And so the short answer is, I don't know, trying to figure that out. But I think one thing, Victoria, baked in your question is, how do you make sure that you're actually reaching users? And the answer to that for us is that the entire process, we are co-designing with our eventual users of whatever tools we're creating. And so we can usually take some solace in the fact that they are with us as our partners every step in the way. And so we're reaching them. I've also been informed by one of our wonderful facilitators that I keep cutting myself off when I mute myself. So I'm going to slowly mute as I end this answer.
Yep, perfect. I'm going to throw a little wrinkle into that previous question. I know that, designing, it takes a village to make any product, to make any design. How do you all balance, or how do you recommend balancing different groups of user needs? It might be, for example, you might have users that are very low on the tech savviness spectrum, and then you have folks who are much, much higher and do not need any sort of tutorials to use a specific tech problem, or might feel very comfortable exploring a tech solution on their own. But I was wondering if you have any perspectives on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's for me, when I'm looking at our current reporting product that I'm looking at designing, there were several approaches we could have taken, some of which would have been more appropriate if you were like a higher data sophistication, more sort of on the technical side, some where you might need a little more hand-holding. So it's really sort of understanding what the broad market is. So we're just kind of wrapping up a research study looking at our Clio lawyers and looking at the industry more generally and trying to quantify what is their data sophistication. And then once we have that quantifiable measurement of what is their data sophistication, we can use that to sort of determine broadly across all users what level of help and guidance are people going to need. And then when we're looking at that study, can we slice that study by people who are in different roles? If we're looking at sort of like someone who's an owner versus a paralegal versus an office administrator, and do we see differences in that data sophistication by role or by organization size? And then we can sort of potentially quantify what sort of help and onboarding would they need when they're coming to a product, and what will they be looking for help with. More generally, I think when I'm sort of looking at something like a product in the legal world up front, it's really important to set personas and archetypes. So when coming onto into the legal aid space and the legal aid product at Clio, it was really spending a lot of time up front in that exploratory stage with, I think we had 17 different organizations I met with across the US, and really sort of understanding the different personas that there are and crafting different personas. Sort of here's a sort of intake specialist, or here we have a staff attorney, and quantifying from that, like what are key tasks? What are their jobs to be done? What are their pain points? And then using those as a series of cards that when we're designing products, we can continually refer back to it. So we can continually sort of balance those multiple users in those multiple different roles, because they will have different jobs to be done and different key tasks while using that same product. So it's really important to understand that you're solving for those people and their jobs and tasks in there, and also solving for their pain points that they have. Because different people will have different pain points and different tasks to do, but they'll use the same product while they're doing it.
I feel like Tamasin's responses are so like practical and applicable, and mine are so pie in the sky. But I feel like it's a great contrast, so I'm going to keep going with it. So in the book Designing Justice, Sasha Costanza-Chalk talks about the matrix of domination, which I believe they borrow from another scholar, Black feminist scholar. Basically, this idea that we all have, in our many different identities, have many different relationships to power and oppression. And when you are designing, you will, unless you're being very intentional about not doing it, you will sort of replicate those relationships of oppression and power. And so for those using legal design to sort of challenge that status quo power relationship, we have to be super careful about sort of which users or which co-designers are getting priority for various design decisions, because sometimes you cannot design for everyone. Well, and Sasha Costanza-Chalk says you really you cannot design for everyone. Like if you design for the default, you're actually going to benefit the folks for whom the status quo typically benefits. And so the way that we sort of try to deal with that is throughout the process. One way is by sort of mapping out our assumptions about the various stakeholders in a project early on. So for example, we're currently working in our clinic with a tenants' rights organization in Newark. And we are looking at this current campaign to oppose some rezoning and redevelopment in a neighborhood called the Ironbound in Newark. And so we got a bunch of tenants and organizers into the classroom with our students, and we all thought about who in the world would care about this project. And then we mapped them on a matrix of how much institutional power they have. So sort of how much do current existing systems and laws benefit them? How much do they have access to it? And then on the y-axis, we have how sort of in solidarity are they with our project? How mission aligned are they? Do they want us to succeed or do they want us to fail? Now, of course, these are our assumptions. We don't actually know at that moment, although we have folks in the room with a wide range of experiences, which helps. But that sort of gives us our roadmap for who is going to kind of get priority when there are conflicts between users. So the folks who are most marginalized by institutions and most in line with the goals of the project, those are like the core users. And those are the folks who we want to make sure are always in the room with us when we're designing. And to the extent that there are decisions to be made in the design process, we want to be prioritizing those folks. Now, of course, it's not that simple because no group is a monolith and there's always going to be contradictions. And so another thing that we do is we talk a lot about ambiguity, which the design school at Stanford has sort of named like a meta design skill, right? This idea of navigating ambiguity. Ironically, lawyers are super uncomfortable with ambiguity. Surprise, surprise. There's this great article I love that I will try to remember the name of so that our facilitators can drop it in the chat. I think it's called something like The Tolerance of Uncertainty. And it's co-written by a lawyer and a psychologist. And it basically says lawyers are trained to hate uncertainty and pretend it doesn't exist whenever possible. You know, we think there's a right answer to everything. And if we don't know it, we're going to fake it. But in design, that really is a disservice to us because we need to be open to all of these possibilities and to the reality that our users are going to conflict in their needs, even within themselves sometimes or over time. And so then I think the answer to that is really just involving as many people in the process as you can and relying on that iteration and that feedback. The more that you can learn about what you're creating, the more you can sort of reach an outcome that is going to account for those differences. But I'm glad Tamasin brought up user personas. We also use user spectrums, which is a tool that was introduced to me by Ashley Trainey and Victoria Suarderman, who are my colleagues. They worked with me on a project when I was at the Graphic Advocacy Project, both incredible user experience researchers. And so this allows for us to take into account a bit more of that ambiguity. So we can think about all of the ways that our various stakeholders might vary, all the different dimensions. So for example, tech savvy to never used a phone. And we can imagine someone who falls in various parts of those spectrums. And that way we can sort of think not only about an individual user and where they might fall in those spectrums, but also as a whole about just all the different considerations that we're holding within this contradictory group of stakeholders.
Yeah, special shout out to our facilitators. I feel like I'm watching a movie and then, you get the actor pop up right below their face. So they're really helpful with our resources there. And if you have another resource that you'd like to ask about, feel free to drop it in the chat. But both of you have touched on this, and it's totally okay if you don't have solutions. But I was wondering if we could just sort of talk a little bit about common traps or pitfalls when doing effective legal design or trying to do effective legal design. And then maybe we can think tank some solutions if we can think of some.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to really understanding your users, I think. And I think one thing that I will continue to say when I go into a new space, especially a new legal space, not coming in with a legal background, is I don't know. And I think it's sometimes that's harder to say early in your career, potentially for designers, to come in and be comfortable saying, I don't know the answer to it. But I think it's really important to be able to put that forward, especially when you come into a complex space like this, and to be able to come in with as much, like, check any unconscious bias at the door, come in as open as possible, and come in being willing to say, I don't know. And just be able to be willing to open, be willing to learn, and be able to kind of just sit back and try and absorb everything from everybody. And I'd say that would be a common pitfall when starting a legal design project, is not being able to come in with that sort of mindset of, I don't know, I need to learn. And being able to sort of put aside any sort of preconceived ideas of what you think the best design might be. Maybe the best and the slickest design that might look best and might move best on screen isn't necessarily appropriate for your users and the ways in which they're using technology. And so it's being able to put that aside and find that balance, and being able to sort of come in just with that open mind to learn. And I really liked what you said, Hallie, about that spectrum, and sort of then really being able to understand that spectrum of users. And another pitfall might sort of coming in and just talking to those first few people and really designing for the first few people and not considering that wider spectrum, not considering those edge cases, and then not, as a result, having a holistic design solution.
100%. And so again, I think this brings up the ambiguity. And so I'll venture to say that lawyers who are engaging in design maybe find this particularly difficult, for us to abandon the idea that we know everything because we've gone through training that rewards us for acting like we're very sure of ourselves all the time. And I can see my clinical students struggle with this. This is something I struggle with massively, even a decade out of law school, and I'm sure I will for the rest of my life. It's really, really hard to not only admit to yourself that you don't know, but to embrace that and to understand that as a value. And I don't know if I have a great answer for how to avoid the pitfalls, but I have seen the power of going through the process and trusting the process. When my colleagues that I previously mentioned, Ashley and Victoria and we put on a 10-week training for justice workers around the country, from legal aid organizations and courts and all sorts of places. This was with the Michigan Advocacy Project, or Michigan Advocacy Program, with funding from LSC. And a lot of groups came in with this idea that they were going to create a tech tool. They were like, we have clients, they need to access information or get through a process, we're going to make a tech tool. And Ashley and Victoria, who were running the class, were like, don't jump to the solution, we don't know yet, hang on, hold your horses, right? And that was so hard. They really already had that idea in their head. And then we went sort of through a mini version of the discovery process, and synthesizing. I remember this one group so clearly. They went through it and they were like, wait, people don't want a tech tool, they just want paper? That's what? And so they were able to go and genuinely learn from their user groups, and their user groups told them quite definitively, hey, I don't have access to technology, or hey, I really prefer to just have a piece of paper I can file away and refer to easily. And so they ended up with a prototype that looked super different from what they were envisioning, but they were able to push through that pitfall. And I think it was because they had great guidance from Ashley and Victoria in the process. So I guess one way to avoid pitfalls is just talk to other people who are doing this work. We all, I think, love to talk about it and share our ideas, and we all need each other for support and to check our assumptions all the time. So I think collaboration generally is the best way.
Speaking of collaboration, I just wanted to also ask, and I want to voice this, how does accessibility factor into legal design? And how does that factor into the process? How does that factor into this particular conversation? And if there's any overlap there at all?
Yeah, I mean, from the product perspective at Clio, we work with what we call a design system. And this means that we're all using the same sets of components across the product. And so we have a team that works on the design system. And so a design system will be, if you're looking at like a button, a drop-down menu, a radio button, a card, the navigation, all of that falls into part of our design system. So we have a very thorough and rigorous process that anything going into our design system has accessibility baked into it. And so accessibility, when I'm thinking it from a product perspective, at a high level, can we move around the product using a keyboard? Is it screen reader accessible? We are not 100% there yet. That is definitely a work in progress, but for any new products going in, you need to be able to navigate without a mouse. You need to be able to use a screen reader. If I'm looking at this, is there enough contrast when there's colors in there? Is there enough contrast between the text foreground and the text background? Is the font a large enough size to pass the strict sort of web content accessibility guidelines? And sort of Clio is aiming to hit AA for those. So for any components going in, is there the right level of contrast? And then also just thinking about color blindness. Red-green color blindness is extremely prevalent. I think something like 30% of men are red-green colorblind. So for those folks, red and green looks like gray. So being really careful with even the smallest details, that you're not relying on a color to denote something that's important in the interface, and always thinking through what backups do I have? If I'm using a color, do I have an icon? If I'm using an icon, does that have descriptive text for it, for if you're on a screen reader? If there's images in there, does it have alternative text that can describe those images? So really kind of thinking through all of the different ways in which people would use an application, and then can they do that?
Yeah, and then in addition to those accessibility standards and best practices for outputs, also thinking about how we make the design process itself accessible. Even something as simple as just making sure that you're reaching users from a wide range of experiences and with a wide range of needs, so that you can accurately design for those needs. I think what I usually say to students when we kind of go over accessibility guidelines is that they're an awesome starting point and hypothesis. And a lot of the time they are going to work, but they're still not a substitute for designing with folks who actually have accessibility needs, and folks with disabilities. And so the more that we can create a design process that facilitates participating with us, the more likely we are to create something at the end that's truly accessible, but also to have a process that more folks can participate in. And so that can include things like providing childcare for discovery sessions, holding feedback or discovery sessions in locations that so for working with tenants, we try to go to their building or to a community meeting space that's near them instead of having them come to the law school, for example. Addressing a variety of language needs. Can we have interpreters? Can we, if we're dealing with a stakeholder group that primarily speaks Spanish, can we hold discovery interviews in Spanish with a live interpreter for the folks who don't speak Spanish? There are so many ways that we can sort of broaden that participation and just remove as many barriers as possible.
I think we lost the tail end of what you just said, Hallie. I'm sorry.
I clearly do not know when to properly mute, but I think I was just saying if we think about these various needs, we can really broaden participation in the design process.
Thank you. Okay, so I know that when we planned this event out, Tamsin, you were wondering if there was going to be a visual component, and I did want to include a sort of show and tell aspect of this because I know we're talking about legal design and it's a little bit odd that we don't have a PowerPoint or something similar to share with the audience. But I was wondering if you all have specific examples, they don't have to come from yourself, of, that is welcome, of effective legal design or your favorite examples of legal design to share.
I can share my screen a minute. It feels super weird when you say favorite legal design to say, hey, I'm going to show you what we just released at Clio. But I think that I've been so deeply in this for the last few months. It's where my head is all kind of wrapped around. And that's custom reports. So we were reimagining what reports looked like at Clio. Why I think this is especially important for legal services organizations is coming into this space. The main thing that I heard from people was just how painful grant reporting is. So many different grant reports to produce to so many different grantors. Everybody has different requirements. Everybody has different formats, different ways in which they want to see stuff, and stuff can change yearly. And to date, there hasn't been a way to do that well in Clio. It's been a lot of getting stuff out into a spreadsheet and then starting to pull pieces together. So this is one that for me is sort of top of mind in this space as well. So I can go ahead and share my screen and do a quick demo on it if you'd like, Victoria.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
I think we've got time.
I can go ahead and do that. Yeah. So we've been demoing this at ClioCon. I've got it down to a 3-minute demo. So I will preface what I'm going to show you, folks, is it's a dev build. It's an early dev build. We're pre-pilot on it. And what we're looking at the moment is just financial data. For any of you folks who are Clio users, we are looking at bringing custom fields in. I know custom fields will be especially important for legal services organizations because they're heavily used for grant reporting. But we essentially want to design a reporting product that had an inane amount of flexibility. You needed to be able to do anything. You need to be able to report on the ways in which you wanted. So now when you come into reporting, you'll see here there's a series of different report cards. You can go ahead and preview these, and you'll be able to see the columns that are in the report. So you can get a sense up front if this is a report you would actually want. But I'm going to take you folks through the workflow of building a new custom report. So if I come in here, I'm brought into our new custom report builder. So I can go ahead, give this a name, give it a description. I can choose categories. There will be customizable categories. So in the future, you folks will be able to kind of put in anything that you want for this. And there will be multiple data sets. And this is where you will have all your data coming in from your custom fields or any of your data in Clio, maybe your matters, your contacts. And so again, apologies for you folks, we just have the financial data in here at the moment. But once you choose a data set that's relevant for your grant reporting needs, you can go ahead and start to choose the different data that you would like to build out your report. If you're not sure what anything is, we have these tooltips here so you can understand what this data is, where it's coming from, and how it's calculated. Can then go ahead and start adding in. You see here I've got a fair amount of data in this one set, but when I've got this in here and I'm happy with a base report, I'll see the columns that are in it, the summary, and I can go ahead and create it. And so for you folks in legal services organizations, if you think about this as your like one base grant report. But then, as I said, every grantor wants something different. Everybody wants something slightly unique. So we brought the flexibility in here with the columns, filters, and groups. So now you can go ahead and start to drag and drop and rearrange these columns so you can get the ordering in which you want. You can show hide different columns, and then you can filter the data in any way that you want. So I might want to filter, let's see, actually, let's filter by responsible attorney. So let's say I want to filter by Cameron and Bailey. And so for any folks that are not Clio users today, before we didn't have any of this available. We have a series of small canned reports. You don't have any of the flexibility to do this. So we're now trying to provide you the flexibility to slice and manipulate your data in any ways you want that makes sense for you. So I'll say I'll go ahead and apply that. And then maybe I also want to group this. So let's maybe group this by practice area, subgroup it by responsible attorney. And now I have a report set up, filtered, grouped, and subgrouped in the ways in which I want. I'm just going to, again, just building data, but assuming that you have managed to sort of arrange this in the exact way that a specific grantor wants to see it, I can then go ahead and save a custom view. I'm going to call this view one. So the nice thing about the flexibility for this, when I come back into my homepage, here's my report, base report that I just created. Here is my custom view that I created. But it might be that you have 10 different grant reports that go out for different grantors, each one just very slightly differently. Maybe one needs to be filtered like quarterly, one needs to be sort of looking at stuff weekly. You can go ahead and create as many custom views of a report as you want. So if you needed the 10 different flavors of this report, you can go ahead, you can just step back again, brings you to the unfiltered report. I can go ahead and be like, oh, okay, actually, I want to look at activity date, last month, apply and close, and that's going to be view two. So this then means that you can come in and just start to create as many different views of these custom reports that you've crafted that you want. And the button that will go here that says schedule will bring up a dialog, and you're going to be able to set that to export on a cadence and send that to anybody in your organization. So the main thing that I'm really excited about this is the potential time saving of it. Just really, I know how long it takes legal services organizations to set up grant reports, to export the data, to manipulate all of the columns. So once this is out with all of the accessible data, it should be a huge time saver just to be able to set up all of these different custom views, have them export, get them sent to the right people, and hopefully have you spend less time in Clio. So that is my quick little demo.
Yeah, I know everybody from a legal aid organization in this call probably perked up their ears when you were talking about improving grant reporting. So it's super exciting. Hallie, any show and tell options for us?
Yeah, I guess I'm not going to show, but I'll drop the URL here so that our wonderful host can pass it along to the broader group if they think that makes sense. But I just want to shout out the East Boston Spatial Justice Lab, which is an initiative run by the New Law Lab at Northeastern Law School. And this is the reason I don't really have a visual is they, like us, are very focused sort of on this idea of process. So they have all kinds of outputs, and indeed art is a key part of what they're exploring. They're looking at challenging the root causes of housing insecurity, putting forth and promoting spatial justice, which is this idea of how resources and benefits and hazards are distributed in space, which, I mean, Tamasin is an architect. I'm sure you've heard of this concept. And so it's a community-based initiative where they are exploring social cohesion and art and advocacy and dialogue as ways to get into these really deep legal problems. So we're huge fans of their work over at the New Jersey Legal Design Lab. And indeed, our lab is very much modeled on New Law Lab. So definitely check them out if anything that I'm saying sounds interesting.
Thank you. I know we're almost at time, so I just want to make sure that we answered any questions that folks might have. I know there was one earlier.
I did spot one in the chat from Vincent. I can read that out and take that on if that would be.
Yeah, I think
helpful,
Hallie
Victoria.
typed a response, but I want to make sure other people listening, if you didn't read the Q&A, that you had an opportunity also if you had a question.
Yeah. So question from Vincent. In your experience, when you need to involve government institutions in your design, when do you invite key players into your universe? In other words, say you want to create a product to assist in a government application. Do you work in silo to create a brand new thing, or do you try to improve gaps in outdated systems? So obviously, again, I'm going to answer this very much from the lens of product development. And that's an interesting thing because that's something more broadly we've faced at Clio again, like when do you start again or when do you try and build on what is there? And so I'll answer the first part first. When do you invite key players into universe? For me, everything around understanding government institutions, needs, key players, that all falls for me into exploratory research. That's something that needs to be understood up front. Like, what are all the needs? What are all the quests? Am I solving the right key problems? So that comes very much at the beginning of the design process to make sure there aren't requirements that we discover too far down the road when we've already started in design, in development, and then we're trying to unwind on that or kind of shoehorn things in as well. When it comes to improving versus building upon, well, product I just showed you reports, we decided to start again with that one. And what determines that is really going to be how much can you build upon it, how much you compromising the user experience, how old is the technology, what is the technology that's built upon, can you continue to build upon it? So a lot of that really becomes a partnership with the developers. So we work very closely with developers to sort of understand at what point does it make sense to stop incurring what we call tech debt and building upon a legacy system? When does it make sense to sort of move into a net new build? So a new build in the product, it's an expensive endeavor up front, potentially, compared to sort of continuing to piecemeal on, but you will get to that tipping point where the technology is too old and the user experience is just too compromised to continue to do that. So I hope that answered your question, Vincent.
Hallie, did you want to read out loud or expand on the question or the answer that you left for Vincent as well?
I think I was sort of primarily focused on this idea of when key players need to be invited, and like Tamasin, I agree. This is something that should happen in the discovery phase, in the exploratory phase, as you are constructing the problem to be solved. The little the caveat I added is if there's a key player, somebody who's really going to have power over your success, but who's opposed to your success, think about whether and how you involve them and whether they actually are key players. Our example is landlords in the tenant landlord space. They have a lot of power and are often in a position to potentially distribute resources. And oftentimes, and I've been somewhat surprised by this, our tenants are sort of drawn to involving them deeply in the process. And this is sort of a tension we've been navigating because we are trying to do everything in a way that's informed by our tenant groups. And we also have this deep distrust, and we're using this analysis from Sasha Costanza-Chock, this matrix of oppression idea, that landlords are sort of, as a material matter, opposed in their interests, even though there are maybe some landlords who would think, yeah, it would be good for my tenants to organize a tenant union. I would love to find those landlords. And so we sort of just urge caution. There is information that some stakeholders may have that might be really key to the design process, but how much design power, as in power to actually make decisions, they have should be approached with some caution there. So if you have government entities who are maybe in a position to distribute a service, maybe their buy-in is necessary for you to create it, I think you're going to have to involve them early on. But if you worry that they are ultimately going to be opposed to the needs of the user group that you're designing with, you might think about other options for moving forward.
I think we have time for one more question. If folks have any, feel free to drop it either into the chat or into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I'm seeing some positive emojis in the chat, so I think folks enjoy the answers to those questions.
And also, if people think of stuff after the fact, please reach out. I love to hear from folks in this space. Like I said, I think we all need to be sharing our understandings and our tools and our tips and tricks and our fears and dreams with each other. So my email address, I will pop it in the chat. And I think I have actually figured out how to message everyone, so I do not need to trouble our wonderful facilitators, but don't hesitate to reach out if you think of questions later.
So there is a question, and I am not familiar with this person's principles, but maybe both of you are. The principles of Edward Deming, I think is the name.
I've heard of him. I want to say he was an American engineer. I might be wrong. I'm not familiar with his principles. So the short answer to that would be I haven't worked with the principles of Edward Deming. If I look for principles of when I'm looking at design, when I think outside of the pure looking at other user experience designers, I tend to, for me, go back to architecture. I especially like Zaha Hadid and Frank Gehry. And so I'll tend to look at some more broader architectural principles and the theoretics of architecture when I'm coming into, and that will be more not for a small feature development, but coming into a large net new product design and trying to think about the principles of how to lay out a large new product area like custom reports and the mental models and structures in which people might approach it. And I find that those have a lot of crossover with architectural principles, so would have a lot of crossover with anything sort of on the engineering front as well. Just, I think with my background, maybe I tend towards the architecture side more of things.
Yes, I also have, I mean, I have never heard of Edward Deming. I just did a quick Google. I see 14 key principles for management. So maybe, Leslie, that's what you're referring to. Maybe not. I have never seen these before. I am always skeptical of principles because the number one principle is to follow the needs of the group that you're designing with. So that's really interesting. I will give it a read. I also see a question from Marissa about collecting a group for user testing. Oh my goodness, this is a big one. I'm sure Tamasin will have a lot to offer here for us, depending on who we're working with. A lot of that is going to be just good old community outreach. We try to partner from the get-go with folks that have deep community ties so that when we get to a point in the process where we're needing to involve a broader swath of stakeholders, we can rely on those relationships. But things that we've done, going to a library, a community meeting, handing out little flyers, giving incentives, always compensate your participants. That's a principle I'll stand by as well, assuming that you can in some way. And as for resources on that, I will think about that. And if I remember anything, I will definitely send it to this group. Edward Deming believed that everyone that touched the process has a certain expertise that needs to be considered. 100%. And that makes me think of, so there is a book that I've referenced quite a bit called The Convivial Toolbox, which is about generative user research. And that is the view of those authors as well. So it sounds like that would be very much aligned, Leslie, with Deming's philosophy. And I definitely recommend Convivial Toolbox for folks interested in this work.
And I think I'll just add on to what I said on the recommending for user testing. So we use user testing and user interviews at Clio. So along with recruiting for Clio customers for testing, and recruiting for non-customers can be a little harder. User interviews and user testing will both come with panelists. So you can screen for looking for people in specific industries, specific demographics, specific areas. When I was earlier in my time at Clio, I was trying to recruit for lower income consumers of legal, or people who were trying to find legal help who were lower income. And that was challenging. I ended up doing short-term gigs on Craigslist for that one. So I was looking for, and again, back to compensating folks, it was a survey. It was a survey that's going to take around 15 minutes. So we compensated people with a gift card draw. So we will quite typically do like win one of 3 gift cards. But I had a surprising amount of success targeting a lot of inner city areas using Craigslist short-term gigs, which is probably my most creative way I've tried to recruit for folks before.
I just wanted to say on the topic of resources, I know that a lot of links have been dropped in the chat. After this webinar, we will be sending an email to all registered participants so that you can gather all of those resources. You don't have to worry about jotting them down. And then also we'll include a way to reach out to both of our panelists. And so if you do have any questions, you'll be able to do that. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you
Really
so much for
enjoyed.
having us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for organizing and moderating, and thanks to all of our attendees, and thanks for all the great questions.